The ultrasound showed nothing at 6 weeks, but the vampire king's fingers found 2 heartbeats through her skin. Dr. Sarah Chen froze as his eyes turned gold in the clinic's fluorescent light. What she didn't know, vampire heirs are invisible to human technology until they choose to be seen. Now he'd never let her leave the examination room. The fluorescent lights hummed above them as Sarah stared at Adrian Blackthorne, her rational mind scrambling to process what she had witnessed. His eyes had shifted from human brown to molten gold in the space of a heartbeat, and now his fingers pressed against her abdomen with a certainty that made her skin crawl. She could feel something responding to his touch, 2 distinct flutters that her ultrasound machine had failed to detect moments before. The examination room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as if the very air had thickened around them. Sarah pulled back instinctively, her white coat catching on the edge of the examination table. She had built her career on facts, on measurable data and scientific certainty, but nothing in her medical training had prepared her for the impossibility standing before her. Adrian withdrew his hand slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, like a predator who understood the delicate balance between patience and strike. The golden gleam in his eyes faded back to brown, but Sarah could still see something ancient lurking beneath the surface. Her patient, Mrs. Rodriguez, remained motionless on the table, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling as if time itself had stopped around her. Sarah reached for her pulse, finding it steady but impossibly slow, as though the woman existed in a different temporal flow. The reality of her situation crashed over her like ice water. This man, this thing, had done something to her clinic, to her staff, to the very fabric of normal existence. She was Dr. Sarah Chen, 28 years old, top of her residency class at Johns Hopkins, fellowship-trained in reproductive endocrinology at Columbia Presbyterian. She had dedicated her life to helping women conceive, to understanding the intricate dance of hormones and cellular development that created new life. Her divorce from Michael had been finalized just 3 months ago, a clean break from a marriage that had withered under the weight of her professional ambitions and his inability to understand her calling. She had thrown herself into her work at the Manhattan Fertility Institute, becoming the youngest department head in the clinic's history. The one-night encounter at the medical conference in Chicago 6 weeks ago had been so unlike her, a moment of weakness after too much wine and the sting of loneliness. She barely remembered his face, just the overwhelming sense of connection and the way he had looked at her as if she contained mysteries worth exploring. Now, staring at Adrian Blackthorne, those scattered memories crystallized into sharp focus. It had been him, this impossible man who claimed to be something beyond human comprehension. Adrian moved around the examination room with fluid grace, his presence filling the space despite his average height and lean build. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit expensive and well-tailored, but there was something timeless about him that spoke of centuries rather than decades. He gestured toward the ultrasound screen, still blank and mocking. "Your machines see what they expect to see, Dr. Chen. My children exist outside the parameters of human technology until they choose otherwise." His voice carried an accent she couldn't place, something that spoke of old-world aristocracy and power that predated modern civilization. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for her phone, but Adrian's expression stopped her cold. "That would be inadvisable," he said softly. "Your staff will remain unharmed as long as you cooperate. My influence extends far beyond this room, far beyond your understanding of what governs this world." She looked toward the door, knowing her nurse Janet should have returned by now, knowing the waiting room should be full of afternoon appointments. The silence pressed against her eardrums like deep water. "What are you?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Adrian smiled, and she caught a glimpse of teeth too sharp to be entirely human. "I am Adrian Blackthorne, vampire king of the Eastern American territories. For 800 years, I have ruled the Shadow Council that maintains the balance between your world and mine, I have searched for centuries to find a human capable of carrying viable vampire heirs. You, Dr. Chen, are unprecedented. The words should have sounded insane, but the evidence surrounded her. The frozen time, the blank ultrasound, the impossible heartbeats she could now feel fluttering beneath her skin. Her scientific mind raced through possibilities, seeking rational explanations that crumbled under the weight of what she was experiencing. Vampire-human hybrids were medically impossible, yet something was growing inside her that defied every law of biology she understood. "This is insane," she whispered. But even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't. The pieces fitted together with terrifying precision. The way he had looked at her in Chicago, the overwhelming attraction she had felt, the dreams that had plagued her for weeks afterward. Dreams of darkness and blood and ancient power that called to something deep in her bones. Adrian stepped closer, and she felt the temperature drop around him. "You belong to me now, Sarah. You carry my heirs, the first viable vampire children born in a millennium. I will protect you at any cost, but make no mistake about your situation. You are mine, and I will not allow harm to come to you or my children." The possessiveness in his voice should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange pull, as if some part of her recognized his claim on a level that preceded rational thought. She pressed her back against the examination table, fighting the urge to submit to the overwhelming presence that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Her mind catalogued details with clinical precision, even as panic threatened to overwhelm her. His skin was too pale, his movements too fluid, his eyes too knowing for any human. Yet when he reached out to steady her as she swayed, his touch was gentle, almost reverent. The world tilted sideways, and Sarah felt herself falling into darkness that tasted of copper and promises she didn't understand. She awakened in a place that defied architectural logic, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that showed Manhattan's skyline from an impossible height. The penthouse stretched around her in elegant curves and shadows, furnished with antiques that spoke of centuries of accumulated wealth. Adrian stood silhouetted against the city lights, his reflection absent from the glass. Sarah struggled to sit up from the leather sofa where she had been placed, her medical bag resting on the coffee table beside her. The familiar weight of her stethoscope around her neck provided an anchor to reality, but everything else felt like stepping into a dream. "How did we get here?" Her voice came out hoarse and thin. Adrian turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "Shadow walking. One of many abilities you will learn to accept in time. Your clinic believes you left for a family emergency. Your absence will not be questioned." Sarah's hands went instinctively to her abdomen, feeling for the strange fluttering sensation that had become more pronounced. "I need to call the police. I need to get out of here. This is kidnapping." Adrian's laugh held no humor. "The police commissioner owes me 3 favors. The mayor's daughter lives only because of my intervention in a supernatural incident last year. The FBI field office has a standing arrangement with my organization. There is nowhere you can run that my influence does not reach." The casual way he spoke of controlling human institutions sent ice through her veins, but it also sparked her analytical mind. She was dealing with something that operated on a scale beyond her experience, but her medical training had taught her to remain calm in crisis situations. "Explain the pregnancy," she demanded. "Tell me how this is possible." Adrian moved to a bar cart, pouring amber liquid into 2 crystal glasses. He offered one to her, but she shook her head. "Vampire human conception has occurred throughout history, but the offspring invariably die before birth. The vampire nature is too aggressive, consuming the human elements before viability can be achieved. Your children are different. They have achieved balance, taking what they need from both heritages without destroying either." He sipped his drink, and Sarah caught the metallic scent of what definitely wasn't whiskey. "The fact that they have survived to 6 weeks indicates they will survive to term. They will be the first of their kind." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. The accelerated growth patterns, the enhanced nutritional demands, the potential complications. Will be managed, Adrian said firmly. You will have the finest supernatural medical care available. Dr. Elena Vasquez will monitor your condition daily. She has 800 years of experience with vampire physiology. The scientific possibilities warred with her survival instincts. These children represented something unprecedented in human biology, a bridge between species that could revolutionize understanding of genetic adaptation and evolutionary potential. But she was also a prisoner of something inhuman and powerful beyond her comprehension. Adrian set down his glass and approached her slowly, as if approaching a skittish animal. I understand your fear, Sarah. I do not expect trust immediately. But I need you to understand that your safety is paramount. My enemies would kill you and my children without hesitation if they learned of your existence. You cannot return to your old life. The gentleness in his voice surprised her. Despite his overwhelming presence and casual display of power, he treated her with careful respect, never coming closer than arm's length without invitation. She could see the restraint it cost him, the way his hands clenched and released as if fighting some deeper impulse. What happens now? She asked. Now you rest, you eat, you allow your body to adapt to what is growing inside you. Elena will arrive tomorrow to begin proper prenatal care. You will learn about the world you have entered, and hopefully, in time, you will understand why this matters beyond your personal circumstances. Sarah stood on unsteady legs, moving toward what she hoped was a bathroom. The penthouse seemed to shift around her, corridors appearing where none had been moments before. She found herself in a luxurious bedroom, the windows showing impossible views of Central Park from an angle that should not exist. A bathroom adjoined, complete with every comfort she could imagine. When she emerged 15 minutes later, she found fresh clothes laid out for her and a meal waiting on a small table. The food was exactly what she would have ordered for herself, down to the specific brand of herbal tea she preferred when stressed. Adrian was nowhere to be seen, but she could sense his presence somewhere in the impossible space around her. She tested the windows and found them sealed, not with locks, but with something that made her hands tingle when she touched the glass. The elevator required a keycard she did not possess. The stairwell door opened onto nothing but swirling shadows. She was truly trapped, caught between worlds in a place that existed partially outside normal reality. As night deepened around the penthouse, Sarah sat by the window and watched the city lights twinkle below. Somewhere inside her, two impossible lives grew stronger by the hour, and she could feel them responding to her emotional state with awareness that should not yet exist. She was Dr. Sarah Chen, reproductive endocrinologist, prisoner of the Vampire King, and carrier of children who might change the balance between human and supernatural worlds forever. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Sarah awakened to unfamiliar silence, the kind that pressed against her eardrums like deep water. The penthouse bedroom held no trace of Adrian's presence, but a woman sat in the velvet armchair beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and her olive skin bearing the unmistakable pallor of the undead. She wore a crisp white coat over tailored black clothing, a stethoscope draped around her neck like a badge of authority. Her eyes, when they met Sarah's, held the weight of centuries tempered by genuine medical concern. I am Dr. Elena Vasquez, the woman said without preamble, her voice carrying a slight Spanish accent that spoke of old Castile rather than modern Mexico. Adrian has asked me to monitor your condition during this unprecedented pregnancy. I have been a physician for 800 years, serving vampire royalty and their rare human companions. Your case, however, is unlike anything in my extensive experience. Sarah struggled to sit up, her body feeling heavier than it should after just one night of sleep. The strange fluttering in her abdomen had intensified, and she could swear she felt two distinct presences responding to her emotional state. Elena moved with fluid grace to check her pulse, her cold fingers finding Sarah's wrist with practiced ease. Your heart rate is elevated, but that is to be expected given the circumstances. Your body is adapting to support vampire offspring, which places demands no human physiology has ever encountered. Sarah pulled her wrist away, medical training asserting itself despite her fear. I need to understand what's happening to me. The growth patterns, the metabolic changes, the apparent consciousness of the fetuses at only 6 weeks. This defies every principle of embryonic development I've studied. Elena smiled, the expression transforming her austere features into something almost maternal. You are thinking like a human physician treating human patients. Vampire children develop according to different principles entirely. They are born with consciousness already formed, with instincts and abilities that manifest from conception. Your twins have been aware of your emotional state since the moment of fertilization, learning to adapt their demands on your system to ensure mutual survival. The clinical explanation sent ice through Sarah's veins. These are not ordinary children, they are predators in development, learning to feed before they are even born. Elena's expression hardened. They are Adrian's heirs, and they will be raised according to vampire traditions that predate your civilization by millennia. But first, they must survive to term, and that requires your cooperation and understanding of the world you have entered. She moved to the window, gesturing toward the cityscape below. Adrian rules the Eastern American territories through a combination of ancient blood oaths and carefully cultivated fear. He commands the loyalty of over 3,000 vampires, from newly made fledglings to ancients who remember the fall of Rome. His inner council consists of those who have sworn themselves to his service through bonds that transcend death itself. But power breeds enemies, and his choice to father children with a human has created unprecedented political instability. Sarah absorbed this information with growing dread. Political instability meant danger, not just to her, but to the children growing inside her. Her medical mind cataloged the implications, while her survival instincts screamed warnings she was only beginning to understand. Elena continued her exposition without mercy. Marcus Aurelius, Adrian's military advisor, commands the territorial defense forces. He is a former Roman centurion turned in the 3rd century, and his loyalty to Adrian stems from a blood debt that can never be repaid. However, his adherence to vampire tradition makes him skeptical of human entanglements. Lucinda Blackwood serves as our spy mistress, maintaining intelligence networks throughout supernatural communities. She was turned during the English Renaissance and brings 4 centuries of political intrigue to her position. Thomas Whitmore handles our liaison with human authorities, ensuring our existence remains hidden while protecting our interests. He is the youngest of the inner circle, turned only 2 centuries ago, but his understanding of modern human institutions makes him invaluable. Each has sworn blood loyalty to Adrian, but each also harbors personal ambitions that your pregnancy may threaten or fulfill. The door opened without sound, and 3 figures entered with the fluid grace characteristic of their species. Marcus stood tallest, his bearing unmistakably military despite his modern clothing. His steel-gray hair was cropped short, and his pale green eyes assessed Sarah with the cold calculation of a strategic planner. Lucinda moved like a dancer, her auburn hair catching light that seemed to bend around her willowy frame. Her smile held secrets and sharp edges in equal measure. Thomas appeared youngest, his sandy hair and earnest expression belying the ancient predator lurking beneath his academic demeanor. They arranged themselves in the room with careful precision, maintaining distances that spoke of old hierarchies and potential conflicts. Marcus spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. The situation is untenable. Human entanglements have always led to exposure and persecution. Our survival depends on remaining hidden, yet this pregnancy threatens everything we have built. Lucinda's laugh held musical notes that made Sarah's skin crawl. Oh, Marcus, where is your imagination? These children could be our bridge to greater power. Imagine vampire heirs who can walk freely in human society, who can infiltrate their governments and institutions without detection. The political possibilities are endless. Thomas adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his academic manner at odds with the predatory stillness of his companions. The legal ramifications alone could destabilize our carefully maintained relationships with human authorities. If word spreads that vampires are capable of reproduction with humans, the panic could lead to another witch hunt era. We cannot afford that level of exposure. Elena interrupted their debate with clinical authority. The immediate concern is not politics but survival. Sarah's body is struggling to support vampire offspring. The children are growing at 3 times normal human rate, placing unprecedented demands on her system. Without intervention, she will die within weeks, taking Adrian's heirs with her. The room fell silent except for the barely audible hum of city life far below. Sarah felt their attention focus on her like searchlights, each ancient mind calculating her value and the cost of her protection. She forced herself to speak, her voice steadier than she felt. What kind of intervention? Elena's expression grew grave. Adrian must share his blood with you regularly, creating a sustaining bond that will allow your body to adapt to vampire demands. The process is intimate and irreversible. Once begun, you will be forever changed, neither fully human nor vampire, but something unprecedented. The feeding will also create a psychic connection between you and Adrian, allowing you to experience fragments of his memories and emotions. Before Sarah could respond, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Adrian materialized from shadows that shouldn't have existed in the bright morning light, his presence immediately commanding absolute attention from his subordinates. His eyes found Sarah's face first, searching for signs of distress or harm, before turning to Elena with unspoken questions. "She is deteriorating faster than anticipated," Elena reported. "The children are drawing more energy than her human physiology can provide. The first feeding must happen within hours, not days." Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The others will wait outside. This is not a spectacle for political consideration." Marcus stepped forward, his military bearing stiff with disapproval. "My lord, the implications of blood bonding with a human must be discussed. The Council will view this as weakness, as corruption of our essential nature." Adrian's eyes flashed gold, and the air itself seemed to thicken with barely restrained power. "The Council will accept my decisions or face the consequences of challenging my authority. Sarah carries my heirs, and she will be protected by any means necessary. This discussion is closed." The 3 subordinates filed out with perfect discipline, but Sarah caught the meaningful glances they exchanged. Politics and personal ambitions swirled beneath the surface of their loyalty, creating undercurrents she was only beginning to perceive. Elena prepared medical equipment with practiced efficiency, while Adrian approached Sarah slowly, giving her time to process what was about to happen. "I know this frightens you," he said quietly. "The bond created by blood sharing is permanent and profound. You will experience memories spanning centuries, emotions that may overwhelm your human consciousness. But without it, you and my children will die." Sarah's hands went instinctively to her abdomen, where she could feel 2 distinct heartbeats growing stronger by the hour. The clinical part of her mind understood the biological necessity, but the rest of her recoiled from the intimacy such a bond would create. She would be forever connected to this ancient predator, her humanity altered in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. Yet the alternative was death, not just for her, but for 2 innocent lives that had never asked to exist. "I consent," she whispered, the words barely audible even in the profound silence of the room. Adrian sat beside her on the bed, his movements careful and deliberate. He lifted her wrist to his lips, and Sarah felt the whisper of fangs against her skin before sharp pain gave way to something far more overwhelming. The blood loss was minimal, but what followed defied every assumption about consciousness and identity she had ever held. Images flooded her mind with brutal clarity. Adrian standing in medieval halls lit by torchlight, his face younger but his eyes already ancient with responsibilities too vast for any human to comprehend. Battles fought in darkness against creatures that made vampires seem gentle by comparison. Centuries of loneliness, of ruling through fear because love was a luxury that could be used against him. The weight of 3,000 lives depending on his decisions, the constant awareness that a single mistake could expose his people to extinction. She experienced his memories of their encounter in Chicago, the shock of finding someone whose life force called to something deeper than mere hunger. His growing certainty as the weeks passed that she carried something unprecedented, something that could change the fundamental nature of vampire existence. The hope and terror that warred within him as he planned this moment, knowing that claiming her would alter both their destinies forever. When the visions finally faded, Sarah found herself collapsed against Adrian's chest, her body shaking with the aftershock of experiencing 8 centuries of accumulated emotion and memory. She could feel him in her mind now, a constant presence that would never fully withdraw. But she could also feel her body responding to whatever his blood carried, strength flowing back into muscles that had been failing under supernatural demands. Elena checked her pulse and blood pressure with professional satisfaction. The bonding is complete and successful. Your vital signs are stabilizing, and the children's growth rate is moderating to sustainable levels. You should experience increased strength and enhanced healing, though you will remain essentially human. Adrian's voice seemed to come from inside her own thoughts as well as through her ears. You hold my life in your hands now, Sarah. The bond works both ways. Should you die, the backlash would likely kill me as well. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah understood that she possessed real power in this relationship. Adrian needed her alive, not just for his children, but for his own survival. The realization should have been comforting, but instead it terrified her further. She was now a critical weakness in the armor of the most powerful vampire in North America, a target that his enemies would prioritize above all others. The sound of breaking glass echoed from somewhere in the penthouse, followed by inhuman shrieks that made every primitive instinct scream danger. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his face grim with battle readiness. Victoria's assassins have found us. Shadow wraiths, at least 6 of them. They're testing our defenses. Adrian was on his feet instantly, his human facade dropping away to reveal the apex predator beneath. He moved toward the door but stopped, his gaze torn between Sarah and the sounds of combat growing closer. Elena stepped forward with medical bag in hand. Go. I will protect her until you return. But Adrian hesitated, the bond between them now making Sarah's safety a physical compulsion, rather than mere strategic necessity. Sarah forced herself to stand, drawing on strength she didn't know she possessed. Go fight them. I'll be here when you return. Adrian's smile was sharp enough to cut steel. Then we begin your real education about the world you've entered. The sounds of supernatural battle echoed through the penthouse as Sarah realized her old life was truly over, replaced by something far more dangerous and complex than she could have imagined. She was no longer just a prisoner or an incubator for vampire heirs. She was a key piece in political games played by creatures old enough to remember the rise and fall of civilizations. And her survival depended on learning those rules faster than her enemies could exploit her ignorance. 2 weeks had passed since the first blood feeding, and Sarah barely recognized the woman staring back at her from the penthouse bathroom mirror. Her brown eyes now held flecks of gold that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and her hearing had sharpened to the point where she could distinguish individual heartbeats from floors below. The sounds of the city that had once been background noise now formed a complex symphony of life she had never imagined possible. She could hear Elena preparing medical equipment in the adjacent room, the soft whisper of fabric against skin as Thomas turned pages in the library, and Marcus conducting tactical discussions via encrypted phone calls from his office 3 floors down. Most remarkably, she could sense the baby's consciousness growing stronger each day, their awareness touching hers, with alien intelligence that made her skin prickle with equal parts wonder and unease. Her reflection showed other changes as well. Her pale skin had taken on a luminescent quality that made her appear carved from moonlight, and her dark hair seemed to absorb and reflect light in patterns that defied optical physics. When she moved, her body responded with newfound grace and strength that felt borrowed from something inhuman. The children were remaking her from within, preparing her physiology for demands no human mother had ever faced. Yet despite these physical adaptations, she remained essentially human in her thoughts and emotions, caught between two worlds with complete belonging in neither. Adrian entered the bathroom without sound, his reflection absent from the mirror behind her. His presence no longer startled her as it once had. The blood bond they shared meant she could feel his approach like a shift in atmospheric pressure. He studied her transformed appearance with satisfaction mixed with something deeper, an emotion she was only beginning to understand through their psychic connection. "The next feeding is due," he said quietly, his voice carrying undertones of reluctance that surprised her. "Your body is adapting remarkably well, but the children's demands continue to increase. Elena believes we need to strengthen the bond if they are to survive to viability." Sarah turned to face him, noting the careful distance he maintained even now. Despite the intimate nature of their blood sharing, he had never presumed physical closeness beyond what medical necessity demanded. His restraint spoke of centuries of self-control, but she could sense the effort it cost him through their connection. The feeding ritual had become a dance of clinical precision and suppressed desire that left both of them drained in different ways. This time was different from the beginning. As Adrian's blood flowed into her system, Sarah found herself pulled deeper into his memories than ever before. She experienced his transformation 800 years ago, when he had been Lord Adrian of Blackthorn, a minor English nobleman caught in political intrigue that cost him his mortality. His maker had been an ancient creature whose name was lost to time, someone who saw potential in a young man's combination of intelligence and ruthless pragmatism. The transformation had been agony beyond human comprehension, 3 days of dying while something alien rewrote his fundamental nature. But worse than the physical pain was the isolation that followed, the gradual realization that he would watch everyone he had ever cared about wither and die while he remained unchanged. Sarah experienced century after century of his existence, the weight of accumulating loss and responsibility that had carved away everything soft and human in his nature. She felt his ascension to power not through ambition, but through necessity, as older vampires fell to time or violence and left power vacuums that threatened the survival of his kind. The crown had been a burden he accepted because someone had to bear it, not a prize he had sought. Through their shared consciousness, she understood that his protection of her stemmed from more than duty to his unborn heirs. For the first time in 8 centuries, he had found someone whose presence eased the fundamental loneliness that defined his existence. She represented not just the future of his bloodline, but the possibility of genuine connection with another being who could understand the weight of impossible choices. When the visions faded, Sarah found herself sobbing against his chest, overwhelmed by the scope of his accumulated sorrow and the tentative hope her presence had awakened. Adrian held her with careful tenderness, his own emotions flowing through their bond in ways that made words unnecessary. She could feel his wonder at experiencing human tears through their connection, his amazement at the warmth of genuine affection after centuries of relationships built on fear or political necessity. "I understand now," she whispered against his shirt. "You are not protecting me just for the babies. You are protecting the first person in centuries who makes you feel less alone." Adrian's response came through their bond rather than spoken words, a flood of emotion too complex for language, hope and terror intertwined with protective instincts that bordered on obsession. She represented everything he had never dared want, and everything he could not afford to lose. The moment of connection was shattered by stabbing pain that doubled Sarah over with surgical precision. Elena appeared instantly, her medical training taking precedence over supernatural concerns as she guided Sarah to the bed. The symptoms were unmistakable to someone with her background: premature labor contractions at only 12 weeks of supernatural development. Elena's examination confirmed Sarah's worst fears. The baby's accelerated growth was placing impossible demands on her human physiology. They were attempting to initiate birth processes her body could not support, creating a crisis that threatened all three lives. Without immediate intervention, the pregnancy would terminate within hours, likely killing Sarah in the process. Adrian paced the room like a caged predator, his careful control fracturing under the weight of helpless rage. 8 centuries of power and influence meant nothing in the face of biological processes he could not command or coerce. Elena presented their options with clinical detachment that barely concealed her own concern. The only guaranteed solution was to transform Sarah completely, making her a vampire capable of supporting vampire offspring through the remaining weeks until viability. But the transformation process itself might kill the babies, and would certainly destroy the unique human elements that had made the pregnancy possible in the first place. Adrian dropped to his knees beside the bed, his ancient pride abandoned in the face of imminent loss. "Let me change you," he pleaded. "It is the only certainty we have. I cannot lose you and my children because of stubborn adherence to your humanity." Sarah gripped his hand with strength that surprised them both, her enhanced abilities finally manifesting under extreme stress. "No, there has to be another way. My medical training combined with Elena's supernatural knowledge, we can find something that preserves what we have while solving the immediate crisis." For hours she worked with Elena to understand the precise nature of the complications. The baby's vampire nature was asserting dominance over their human heritage, trying to force premature birth because they had outgrown what they perceived as inadequate human gestation. But Sarah's medical insight revealed a crucial detail. The children were not trying to escape her womb, but to establish a stronger connection with it. They needed a more stable anchor to vampire physiology without abandoning their human origins entirely. Elena's ancient texts contained references to claiming rituals, ceremonies that bound human life force to vampire essence without requiring full transformation. The ritual was dangerous, had been banned for centuries because of its potential for creating unstable bonds that drove participants to madness. But it offered the possibility of giving Sarah enough vampire characteristics to sustain the pregnancy while preserving her essential humanity. Marcus burst into the room as they finalized preparations, his military bearing rigid with disapproval. The claiming ritual weakens the vampire participants significantly, leaving them vulnerable for days afterward. In our current political situation, with Victoria Sterling's forces probing our defenses, this is strategic suicide. Adrian's response carried the absolute authority of 8 centuries of rule. "The ritual will proceed. Station additional guards, call in reinforcements from our allied houses, do whatever is necessary to maintain security. But Sarah and my children will not die because of political considerations." Thomas appeared behind Marcus, his scholarly demeanor masked with genuine concern. "My lord, our intelligence networks report Victoria has arrived in New York with a formal challenge. She demands you choose between your crown and your human. The ancient laws require your response within hours." Adrian's smile held enough venom to kill armies. "Then she will have her answer after the ritual is complete. Begin preparations immediately." The ceremony took place in Adrian's private chambers, a room Sarah had never seen that existed in the building's architectural impossibilities. Ancient symbols covered every surface, carved into stone walls that predated the city above them. Candles provided the only illumination, their flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with deliberate purpose. Elena and Thomas served as witnesses, their roles prescribed by rituals that stretched back to vampire civilization's earliest days. Sarah lay at the center of an intricate circle, her hands resting on her abdomen where she could feel the babies responding to the magical energies gathering around them. Adrian knelt beside her, a ceremonial blade in his hands that had been used for this purpose across centuries of vampire history. The ritual began with words and languages that had died before human civilization learned to write. Power flowed through the ancient syllables, connecting Sarah to forces that existed beyond human comprehension. She felt her life force extending toward Adrian's supernatural essence, seeking the balance that would allow her human nature to support vampire offspring without losing itself entirely. But as the binding reached its crucial moment, the chamber walls exploded inward with supernatural force. Victoria Sterling materialized through shadows that writhed with malevolent intelligence, her appearance unchanged from paintings Sarah had seen that dated back centuries. She stood barely 5 feet tall, her platinum blonde hair framing features of such perfect beauty they seemed carved rather than born. Her eyes held the cold intelligence of something that had survived since before the fall of Rome, and her smile promised suffering beyond imagination. Behind her came creatures that defied easy description, shadow wraiths that moved like liquid darkness given predatory purpose. The ritual circle flickered, but held as Adrian threw himself between the attackers and Sarah, his transformation into something purely vampiric, happening so quickly it blurred even her enhanced vision. Thomas and Elena flanked him with weapons that gleamed with silver and other metals that made the shadows recoil, but they were outnumbered by forces that seemed to multiply in the darkness. Sarah felt the ritual's power wavering as Adrian's concentration was torn between completing the ceremony and defending against Victoria's assault. The magical energies that had been flowing between them began to destabilize, threatening to tear both their minds apart if the binding was not completed or properly severed. Drawing on medical training that had taught her to function under extreme pressure, she forced herself to focus on the ritual words Elena had taught her, pouring her own will into maintaining the connection, even as supernatural battle raged around them. The incomplete binding created something unprecedented in vampire history. Instead of the controlled sharing of essence the ritual was designed to produce, Sarah found herself able to sense Adrian's emotions and approximate location with perfect clarity. She could feel his battle rage, his terror at potentially losing her, and his amazement as he realized she had saved the ritual through her own strength rather than depending on his protection. Simultaneously, Adrian gained the ability to monitor her life force directly, knowing instantly if she faced danger or distress regardless of physical distance between them. The connection was deeper than the blood bond they had shared, more intimate than any relationship either had imagined possible. Victoria's attack faltered as she realized what she was witnessing. The ritual had not failed but transformed into something beyond her understanding or ability to counter. Sarah was no longer purely human, but not vampire either, existing in a state that defied the ancient laws governing their kind. The baby's frantic movement calmed as they found the stable connection they had been seeking, their development resuming at a sustainable pace that would allow them to reach viability. Victoria's retreat was as sudden as her arrival, but her parting words carried promises of greater conflicts to come. "This abomination will not stand. The Elder Council will hear of what you have done, Adrian. You have corrupted the ancient ways for the sake of human sentiment, and there will be consequences that reach far beyond your small territory." As silence returned to the damaged chamber, Sarah realized she had crossed another threshold in her transformation from human doctor to something entirely unprecedented. The bond with Adrian now connected them on levels that made traditional relationships seem pale by comparison, and the political implications of what they had accomplished would reshape vampire society in ways none of them could predict. She was no longer just carrying Adrian's heirs. She had become a living bridge between human and vampire nature that threatened every assumption both species held about their fundamental differences. The aftermath of Victoria's attack left the penthouse transformed into a fortress of supernatural paranoia and political maneuvering. Sarah recovered from the claiming ritual in Adrian's private chambers, while messages arrived hourly from vampire houses across the globe demanding explanations for what they termed his corruption of sacred ceremonies. Her body had stabilized remarkably after the interrupted binding, the baby's frantic growth moderating to a pace that no longer threatened immediate death. But the political ramifications of their unprecedented bond rippled outward like shockwaves through the hidden supernatural world. Adrian spent his days in emergency council sessions, his usual commanding presence strained by the need to maintain authority, while defending choices that violated centuries of vampire tradition. Sarah could feel his stress through their connection, the weight of leadership that had always isolated him, now compounded by the knowledge that his personal happiness might cost his people their survival. She watched from the windows as additional security forces arrived at the building, vampires whose loyalty was purchased with blood debts and ancient promises rather than genuine affection for their king. The penthouse had become a prison of protection where every shadow might hide an assassin and every alliance carried the potential for betrayal. Elena monitored Sarah's condition with increased vigilance, noting changes that defied medical explanation even by supernatural standards. The claiming ritual had awakened abilities in Sarah that shouldn't exist in any creature, human or vampire. She could now perceive the supernatural auras that surrounded Adrian's people, seeing their emotional states and detecting deception with accuracy that made her invaluable for political strategy. When Marcus reported intelligence about enemy movements, Sarah could sense the truth or falsehood of his information through visual distortions that surrounded dishonest vampires like heat shimmer. Her enhanced perception revealed layers of intrigue within Adrian's inner circle that troubled her deeply, suggesting loyalties more complex than simple blood oaths could ensure. The baby's development had accelerated beyond Elena's most optimistic projections, their supernatural strength evident in the way they moved within her womb. Sarah's belly had grown to the size of a full-term pregnancy, despite being only 14 weeks along by human calculations, the rapid expansion causing physical strain that required constant medical attention. She could feel their individual personalities emerging, one more aggressive and impatient, while the other demonstrated careful observation of their environment. They responded to Adrian's voice and presence with increased activity, already recognizing their father's supernatural signature through the womb walls. Most remarkably, they seemed to understand when danger threatened, becoming still and quiet during moments of high tension, as if instinctively protecting themselves and their mother from detection. During one of Elena's examinations, Sarah caught subtle changes in Marcus's behavior that set her new abilities on high alert. The Roman centurion's military bearing remained impeccable, but his aura showed flickering patterns that suggested internal conflict between loyalty and duty to something beyond Adrian's authority. She watched him carefully during subsequent council meetings, noting how his gaze lingered on her with expressions that mixed protectiveness with something approaching regret. His tactical reports about Victoria's movements seemed accurate, but Sarah detected omissions and careful word choices that suggested he knew more than he revealed. The realization that Adrian's most trusted advisor might be compromised sent ice through her veins, but she needed proof before making accusations that could shatter the fragile coalition keeping them alive. Her opportunity came when Dmitry Volkov arrived unannounced with a security detail that made even Marcus step back in wary respect. The Russian vampire lord stood nearly 7 feet tall, his presence filling rooms like a force of nature barely contained within human form. His hair was silver white despite his apparent youth, and his pale blue eyes held the calculating intelligence of someone who had survived centuries of political upheaval through careful planning and ruthless execution. He spoke English with an accent that carried echoes of imperial courts and revolutionary violence, his words chosen with the precision of someone who understood that careless speech could trigger wars. Dimitri's arrival changed the dynamic of Adrian's council immediately. He brought news of European vampire houses mobilizing against Adrian's violation of ancient law, but also offered military resources and safe houses that could protect Sarah during the coming conflict. His loyalty to Adrian stemmed from events during the Russian Revolution, when Adrian had helped him evacuate his human family before their transformation could endanger them, a debt of honor that transcended political considerations. More importantly, Dimitri's intelligence networks had uncovered Victoria's true intentions, plans that went far beyond simple elimination of Sarah and the unborn children. Using her enhanced perception, Sarah studied Dimitri carefully as he delivered his report, noting the complete absence of deception in his aura. Victoria intended to capture the babies alive, raising them in European vampire society as weapons against their father. She believed that vampire children with human heritage could walk freely in mortal society while possessing full supernatural abilities, making them perfect infiltrators and assassins. Her plan required Sarah's death after delivery, ensuring the children would bond with their captor rather than their mother, but she needed them alive and healthy to fulfill her vision of vampire supremacy through hybrid offspring. Adrian's reaction to this intelligence was swift and absolute. Emergency protocols locked down the penthouse while messages went out to every vampire who owed him favors across North America. Sarah witnessed for the first time the true scope of his influence as responses arrived from supernatural communities she had never imagined existed. Werewolf packs offered military assistance, ancient witches provided magical wards, and vampire houses that had remained neutral in previous conflicts declared their support for Adrian's authority. The gathering storm of supernatural politics made Sarah understand that her pregnancy had become the catalyst for conflicts that would reshape the hidden world, regardless of the outcome. Despite the mounting pressure, Adrian carved out moments of unexpected intimacy with Sarah that revealed depths to their relationship beyond political necessity and magical bonds. They spent evening hours discussing names for the babies, with Adrian sharing stories of his human childhood that helped Sarah understand the man he had been before centuries of rule hardened him into something alien. He spoke of hoping to teach his children about both sides of their heritage, ensuring they could choose between human warmth and vampire strength rather than being trapped between worlds, as Sarah felt herself to be. She found herself planning for a future that seemed increasingly unlikely as enemy forces gathered, but these conversations gave her something to fight for beyond mere survival. Victoria's formal challenge arrived with the pomp and ceremony of medieval diplomacy, delivered by an emissary who dissolved into shadow the moment his message was complete. The vampire queen demanded Adrian choose between his crown and his human, offering single combat to determine the fate of both Sarah and the unborn children. Vampire law supported her right to challenge Adrian's authority when his actions threatened their society's fundamental principles, and tradition required his acceptance or public admission of weakness that would destroy his political position. The challenge placed Adrian in an impossible situation where victory meant risking Sarah's safety while defeat guaranteed her death and the capture of his heirs. Sarah's response surprised everyone in the room, including Adrian himself. Drawing on her medical knowledge and newfound understanding of vampire physiology, she proposed invoking an obscure provision of ancient law that allowed trial by wisdom rather than combat when disputes involved matters of supernatural biology. Her medical expertise gave her standing to challenge Victoria's claims about the danger posed by hybrid offspring, potentially turning the vampire queen's own arguments against her. She could demonstrate through medical evidence that the babies posed no threat to vampire society, while simultaneously exposing weaknesses in Victoria's authority that stemmed from her ignorance of modern science and medicine. The gambit was dangerous, requiring Sarah to present herself before a tribunal of ancient vampires who viewed her existence as an abomination. But it offered their only chance of victory, without bloodshed that could claim innocent lives. Adrian's initial reaction was absolute refusal. The thought of exposing Sarah to direct examination by hostile vampires triggering protective instincts that bordered on madness. But as she explained her reasoning, he began to understand the elegant logic of using his enemy's own laws and prejudices against them. Victoria's challenge assumed that all vampire-human hybrids would be unstable monsters, because that had been true historically, but Sarah's medical knowledge could prove that these particular children were different, evolved beyond the limitations of previous attempts at crossbreeding. The strategy required perfect execution and complete trust between them, but it offered the possibility of not just survival, but transformation of vampire law itself. Marcus's reaction to Sarah's proposal revealed the depth of his internal conflict and ultimately forced his hand. During the strategy session where they planned her presentation to the vampire tribunal, his aura showed patterns of such intense stress that Sarah realized he could no longer maintain his deception. His loyalty was not to Victoria Sterling personally, but to the ancient vampire law that forbade human-vampire reproduction on pain of death. His centuries of service to Adrian had been genuine, but his adherence to traditions that predated their relationship made him incapable of supporting actions that violated what he saw as fundamental principles of vampire survival. When pressed by Adrian for his tactical assessment of Sarah's strategy, Marcus finally revealed his true position with the formal language of someone delivering a military report that would end his career. He could not support plans that further violated ancient law, regardless of their tactical merits or potential benefits. His duty to vampire society as a whole superseded his personal loyalty to Adrian, and he would be forced to testify against Sarah's proposal if called upon by the tribunal. The revelation of Marcus's opposition hit Adrian like a physical blow, centuries of trust and shared responsibility crumbling in the space of a few carefully chosen words. Sarah felt his pain through their bond, understanding that he was losing not just a military advisor, but the closest thing to a friend that his position had allowed. Marcus had been present for every major decision of Adrian's reign, had helped shape policies that governed thousands of vampire lives across the continent, and his defection would be seen by other houses as evidence that even Adrian's inner circle recognized the corruption of his recent choices. The political implications were staggering, but the personal betrayal cut deeper than any strategic consideration. As Marcus prepared to leave Adrian's service with the military precision that had defined their relationship, Sarah realized that the coming confrontation with Victoria Sterling would test not just her medical knowledge and legal arguments, but the fundamental bonds between creatures whose nature predisposed them to solitary existence. The vampire world operated on principles of individual power and carefully negotiated hierarchies, concepts that her pregnancy and bond with Adrian challenged at the most basic level. She was asking ancient creatures to accept that connection and cooperation might be stronger than isolation and dominance, a philosophy that threatened everything they believed about their own nature. The success or failure of her gambit would determine not just her own survival and that of her children, but whether vampire society could evolve beyond the limitations that had defined it for millennia. The truth about Marcus's loyalty emerged with the calculated precision of a military operation he had spent months planning in secret. As Sarah watched his aura shift from conflict to resolution, she realized his reports to Adrian had been carefully edited versions of intelligence he had been sharing with powers that superseded any single vampire king's authority. The Elder Council consisted of vampires so ancient they predated written history, creatures who had witnessed the rise and fall of human civilizations while maintaining the hidden laws that governed all supernatural beings. Marcus had served them for over a millennium before swearing his oath to Adrian, and when those loyalties came into direct conflict, his choice had been inevitable from the beginning. His confession carried the weight of someone delivering a death sentence with full understanding of its implications. The elders had been watching Sarah's pregnancy since the moment of conception, their supernatural senses detecting the unprecedented energy signature of vampire-human fusion across continents. They viewed her existence as a violation of their most fundamental taboo, one established in the earliest days of vampire civilization, when previous hybrid offspring had nearly exposed their kind to human persecution through uncontrolled displays of supernatural ability. Adrian's protection of Sarah was seen as rebellion against authority that transcended any individual vampire's rule, and the claiming ritual had pushed their tolerance beyond acceptable limits. The formal summons arrived within hours of Marcus's revelation, delivered through channels that bypassed Adrian's usual intelligence networks entirely. The Elder Council demanded Sarah and Adrian's immediate appearance before their tribunal in Edinburgh, where the oldest vampire city in existence lay hidden beneath Scotland's capital in chambers that had been carved from living rock before human civilization learned to work metal. Failure to appear would result in Adrian's formal excommunication from Vampire Society and the deployment of hunter assassins who had never failed to complete their assigned terminations. The message was clear, despite its archaic formality: compliance or death, with no middle ground for negotiation or delay. The journey to Edinburgh required Adrian to temporarily abandon his North American territories to the protection of subordinates whose loyalty was now questionable without Marcus's military expertise to maintain discipline. Dmitry Volkov provided transportation through methods that bypassed human detection entirely, shadow walking techniques that allowed instantaneous travel between locations marked with specific supernatural signatures. Sarah's first experience with long-distance supernatural transportation left her disoriented and nauseous, the babies responding to the dimensional stress with increased movement that bordered on distress. The sensation of existing outside normal space-time while conscious was overwhelming, like being dissolved and reconstructed according to physical laws that human minds were never designed to comprehend. Edinburgh's supernatural undercity exceeded Sarah's wildest imaginings of what hidden vampire society might encompass. The chambers extended for miles beneath the human city above, connected by tunnels that had been excavated over millennia and illuminated by phosphorescent minerals that gave everything an otherworldly glow. Ancient architecture from dozens of historical periods created a maze of corridors and halls where Roman columns supported Gothic arches that opened onto spaces designed according to mathematical principles that predated human understanding of geometry. The vampire population she glimpsed in passing represented every era of human history, their clothing and bearing marking them as creatures who had retained the characteristics of their mortal origins while adapting to immortal existence in a society that valued age above all other considerations. The Elder Council chamber occupied the deepest level of the underground complex, a circular space carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 12 thrones arranged around the room's perimeter held figures whose age was visible in their perfect stillness, vampires so old they had transcended the need for human-like movement or expression. Their leader, if such terms applied to beings of equivalent authority, was introduced as Morrigan, a name that carried weight from Celtic mythology, but belonged to a creature who had existed long before humans created stories about supernatural beings. Her appearance suggested a woman in her 30s, but her eyes held depths that spoke of witnessing the birth and death of ice ages, and her voice carried harmonics that resonated in frequencies below human hearing range. The formal charges against Adrian and Sarah were read in languages that had been forgotten by human scholars, but their meaning was clear through supernatural translation that bypassed linguistic barriers entirely. Adrian stood accused of violating the fundamental law that prohibited vampire-human reproduction, while Sarah faced charges of corrupting vampire bloodlines through her willing participation in forbidden breeding experiments. The penalties for conviction were absolute. Adrian's execution through exposure to sunlight while bound with silver chains, and Sarah's transformation into a vampire followed immediately by execution to prevent the birth of hybrid offspring that threatened vampire society's survival through potential exposure to human authorities. The Elder Council's explanation of why vampire human children were forbidden revealed the historical foundation for their absolute opposition to Sarah's pregnancy. Previous hybrid offspring had indeed become monsters, creatures whose supernatural abilities manifested without control or discretion, leading to incidents where human authorities had come dangerously close to discovering the truth about vampire society. Children born with vampire strength, but human emotional instability, had committed public acts of violence that required massive cover-up operations involving the elimination of dozens of human witnesses. Hybrids with partial supernatural abilities had proven unable to maintain the careful deceptions that allowed vampires to exist alongside human civilization without detection, and their public mistakes had nearly triggered systematic persecution that would have destroyed both species. The elders had concluded that any mixing of vampire and human bloodlines was inherently unstable and posed an existential threat to their carefully maintained secrecy. Sarah's defense drew upon every aspect of her medical training, combined with her newfound understanding of vampire physiology, to demonstrate that her children represented something unprecedented in supernatural history. Using anatomical charts and biological evidence that Elena had helped her prepare, she showed how the baby's development differed fundamentally from previous hybrid pregnancies in ways that addressed every historical concern about uncontrolled abilities. Her medical monitoring had documented that the children possessed innate awareness of when to conceal or display their supernatural characteristics, suggesting a level of conscious control that previous hybrids had completely lacked. The claiming ritual had created feedback loops between her human consciousness and their developing vampire nature, allowing them to learn discretion and self-regulation from within the womb itself. More importantly, their growth patterns showed balance rather than the chaotic acceleration that had characterized previous hybrid development, indicating stability that could support long-term survival without the violent instability that had made their predecessors dangerous to vampire secrecy. The elders listened to her presentation with the impassive attention of creatures who had heard countless arguments over millennia, but Sarah could sense their genuine surprise at the thoroughness of her medical documentation and the logical structure of her reasoning. Their ancient minds were accustomed to decisions based on tradition and precedent rather than empirical evidence, but her scientific approach to supernatural biology challenged their assumptions in ways they could not simply dismiss. However, Morrigan's response made clear that intellectual curiosity alone would not override laws established through bitter historical experience. Proof beyond theoretical arguments was required, evidence that could only be obtained through direct examination of the babies while they remained in Sarah's womb. The vampiric mental probe they proposed would allow the elders to assess the children's consciousness and control directly, but the process carried significant risk of psychological damage to both mother and offspring if conducted by beings whose mental strength could overwhelm human-derived consciousness entirely. The examination itself was unlike any medical procedure Sarah had ever experienced or imagined possible. The 12 elders surrounded her with their combined mental presence, their consciousness pressing against her mind like ice-cold water seeking to penetrate every thought and memory. She felt them probe the bond between herself and the babies, testing the strength of the connection that allowed her human awareness to influence their developing vampire nature. The invasion was terrifying in its completeness, leaving no corner of her mind private or protected. But she endured it because the baby's survival depended on demonstrating their unprecedented stability. Through the psychic connection, the elders experienced her children's consciousness directly for the first time, and their shock was palpable as they realized the implications of what they discovered. The twins were not only sentient, but actively choosing to remain hidden from detection, their supernatural abilities under conscious control despite their incomplete development. They demonstrated awareness of their parents' emotional states and responded to perceived threats by further concealing their vampire characteristics, exactly the opposite behavior pattern from historical hybrids who had instinctively displayed their power when stressed or frightened. Most remarkably, they showed the capacity for what could only be described as strategic thinking, adjusting their supernatural signature to match whatever level of concealment their circumstances required. Victoria Sterling's arrival in the council chamber interrupted the examination at its crucial moment, her presence announced by temperature drops and shadow distortions that spoke of traveling through supernatural dimensions while in a state of barely controlled rage. She had clearly expected Sarah's examination to reveal the dangerous instability that would justify immediate termination, and the discovery that the babies possessed unprecedented control threatened to undermine her entire position. Her demand for immediate trial by combat, despite the wisdom-based format already in progress, violated established procedures, but her authority as European vampire nobility gave her the right to challenge any decision that affected continental vampire security. Adrian's response was swift and uncompromising, accepting her challenge with the calm certainty of someone who had been anticipating this confrontation since the moment he had chosen to protect Sarah over political expediency. Sarah's intervention shocked everyone present, including the ancient elders, who had not expected a human to demonstrate such detailed knowledge of vampire law and precedent. She cited specific provisions that protected pregnant females from combat-related stress during supernatural disputes, using Victoria's own appeal to ancient law against her by demanding protection under traditional codes that predated any of their current conflicts. Her legal argument was flawless in its logic and precedent, forcing Victoria to choose between abandoning her challenge or admitting that she placed personal ambition above the very laws she claimed to defend. The babies chose that moment to demonstrate their capabilities directly, their combined consciousness reaching out to influence the elders' decision through methods that bypassed every known limitation of hybrid supernatural ability. They projected feelings of protective innocence combined with strategic intelligence that proved their potential for existing within vampire society without threatening its fundamental secrecy. Their mental touch carried reassurance rather than the chaotic aggression that had characterized previous hybrid offspring, showing the elders that they represented evolution rather than corruption of vampire bloodlines. The contact was brief but profound, leaving the ancient vampires with the unmistakable understanding that these children would grow into beings capable of bridging human and vampire societies rather than threatening both. Morrigan's pronouncement of the tribunal's decision carried the weight of absolute authority backed by millennia of supernatural law and precedent. The pregnancy would be allowed to continue, but with conditions that fundamentally altered Sarah's future, regardless of her personal preferences. The children must be raised within vampire society from birth, educated according to ancient traditions that would ensure their loyalty to supernatural rather than human values. Sarah herself would be granted protected status within vampire civilization, but her days of existing in the human world were permanently ended. The decision represented victory in the narrow sense of survival, but Sarah understood that she had traded her old life for the safety of her children and a future that remained fundamentally uncertain despite its legal protections. Victoria's reaction to the elders' ruling was explosive in its intensity, her carefully maintained composure shattering into something approaching madness as she realized her carefully planned campaign had not just failed but backfired spectacularly. Her accusations of corruption and favoritism fell on deaf ears among beings whose authority predated her own by millennia, and her threats of rebellion were met with the kind of quiet certainty that suggested consequences too severe for public discussion. As the tribunal dispersed and arrangements were made for Sarah's protected return to Adrian's territories, She realized that surviving the elder's examination was only the beginning of challenges that would reshape both her identity and her children's futures in ways that remained impossible to predict. The return journey to New York carried the weight of Pyrrhic victory. Success measured not in freedom gained, but in the careful parameters of survival that had been negotiated with beings whose mercy was indistinguishable from calculated political strategy. Sarah felt the presence of elder watchers even before she saw them, ancient vampires whose assignment to monitor her pregnancy represented both protection and imprisonment, disguised as concern for supernatural law compliance. 3 of them had been selected for the task, each representing different aspects of elder authority and each possessing abilities that made escape or deception impossible to contemplate. Serafina appeared to be a young woman with Mediterranean features whose gentle demeanor concealed 8 centuries of experience in supernatural medicine and whose task was ensuring the babies developed according to acceptable vampire standards. Aldrich maintained the appearance of a scholarly gentleman, whose true purpose was monitoring Sarah's psychological adaptation to her new status as a protected but fundamentally powerless member of vampire society. The third watcher remained unnamed and largely invisible, a presence Sarah could sense but never see directly, whose role was clearly enforcement should the other 2 determine that more direct intervention was necessary. Their presence transformed Adrian's penthouse from a refuge into a supervised detention facility where every conversation was monitored and every decision was subject to review by authorities who answered to no earthly power. The immediate aftermath of their return forced Sarah to confront the magnitude of what her survival had cost in terms of personal autonomy and connection to her former life. Her medical practice at the Manhattan Fertility Institute had been quietly dissolved during her absence, her patients transferred to other physicians with explanations that cited family emergencies requiring indefinite leave. Her apartment had been cleared out and her personal possessions moved to storage facilities controlled by Adrian's organization, effectively erasing Dr. Sarah Chen from all official records without leaving traces that might prompt unwanted questions. The few human friendships she had maintained outside her professional life were quietly severed through methods that ranged from supernatural influence to carefully orchestrated circumstances that made continued contact impossible. Elena explained these arrangements with clinical detachment that barely concealed her sympathy for the choices that had been made, without Sarah's input or consent. But the vampire physician made clear that protecting the babies required complete separation from human society, regardless of personal cost. The pregnancy had progressed to the supernatural equivalent of full term, 20 weeks by human calculation, but representing development that would normally require 9 months of gestation. Sarah's body showed extreme stress from supporting growth that pushed her human physiology beyond its designed limits. Her skin stretched tight over an abdomen that contained children whose supernatural strength was already evident through their movements. Elena's daily examinations revealed concerning signs that delivery was imminent, whether Sarah's body was prepared for it or not. The baby's accelerated development creating pressures that her human anatomy could barely contain. Sleep became impossible as the children's nocturnal activity increased, their vampire nature asserting itself more strongly as birth approached, and their need for concealment decreased. Adrian spent increasing amounts of time in emergency conferences with subordinates whose loyalty was being tested by pressures from vampire houses that viewed the Elder Council's decision as political weakness rather than legal precedent. But Sarah could feel his constant awareness of her condition through their bond regardless of physical distance. Victoria Sterling's response to her legal defeat was both predictable and ingenious in its exploitation of the one weakness that vampire society had never successfully addressed. Unable to challenge the Elder Council's decision directly, without risking open rebellion that would result in her own destruction, she instead orchestrated a campaign that brought human authorities into direct conflict with Adrian's organization for the first time in decades. FBI agents began investigating Sarah's disappearance from the fertility clinic with thoroughness that suggested access to information that should have been impossible for human law enforcement to obtain. Missing persons reports filed by concerned colleagues triggered federal involvement when background checks revealed inconsistencies in Sarah's employment history and financial records that had been hastily altered to support the cover story of Family Emergencies. Special Agent Jennifer Martinez led the investigation with determination that spoke of personal investment in the case beyond professional obligation. Her questions probing areas that came dangerously close to exposing supernatural involvement in Sarah's disappearance. Victoria's manipulation of human authorities was masterful in its understanding of how mortal law enforcement could be weaponized against creatures who depended on secrecy for survival, but it also revealed her willingness to risk exposure of their entire society in pursuit of personal vengeance against Adrian and his unprecedented choices. The FBI investigation created pressure that threatened to collapse the carefully maintained barriers between human and vampire worlds, forcing Adrian to choose between protecting Sarah and preserving the secrecy that had allowed his people to survive for millennia. Thomas worked desperately to contain the investigation through his network of human contacts and supernatural influence, but Agent Martinez's determination proved resistant to standard methods of misdirection and memory alteration that had worked effectively on less dedicated investigators. Her partner, Agent David Chen, shared Sarah's surname in what was clearly not a coincidence, suggesting that Victoria had identified and exploited family connections that created emotional investment in the case beyond normal professional interest. The possibility that Sarah's own relatives were being used as unwitting weapons against her safety added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation where every solution created new dangers that threatened innocent lives. Sarah realized with growing horror that her existence had become a threat to both worlds she had tried to bridge through her unprecedented pregnancy, vampire law and human law converging on her location with forces that could not be reconciled or negotiated away. The stress of this realization, combined with her body's increasing inability to support the supernatural demands of near-term vampire offspring, triggered the onset of labor at what Elena calculated as the equivalent of 35 weeks human development. The babies were strong enough to survive birth, but their early arrival would require medical intervention that exceeded the capabilities of both human and vampire medicine operating independently. Sarah's contractions began during a strategy meeting where Adrian was attempting to coordinate responses to FBI surveillance that was tightening around the penthouse like a slowly closing trap, the timing suggesting that the babies possessed awareness of their parents' emotional states and were responding to perceived threats by attempting to complete development outside their mother's increasingly stressed physiology. Elena's examination confirmed that delivery was inevitable within hours, regardless of external circumstances, but the baby's positioning and size made natural birth impossible for someone with Sarah's human anatomical limitations. The medical crisis required surgical intervention using techniques that combined vampire healing abilities with human surgical precision, procedures that had never been attempted because no previous hybrid pregnancy had progressed far enough to make them necessary. Victoria chose that moment to launch her final assault, using the FBI investigation as cover for supernatural attacks that could be attributed to human law enforcement actions if they succeeded in eliminating Sarah and claiming the children. Federal agents surrounded the building while shadow creatures infiltrated through methods that bypassed all physical security, creating chaos that made coordinated defense impossible while Sarah's labor progressed with increasing urgency. Adrian found himself torn between protecting his territory from human authorities who could destroy his organization through exposure and defending against supernatural enemies whose attack was timed to exploit his divided attention. The sound of helicopters circling overhead mixed with inhuman shrieks echoing through the building's ventilation system as Sarah experienced contractions that threatened to tear her apart from within. Elena worked frantically to prepare surgical equipment while maintaining defensive spells that kept Victoria's assassins from reaching the medical suite, her centuries of experience tested by circumstances that no previous vampire physician had ever confronted. Sarah's medical training allowed her to understand exactly how close she was to death, as her body began failing under the combined stress of supernatural labor and the psychic pressure of battles being fought throughout the penthouse. The baby's supernatural strength was actively fighting against her human anatomy's limitations, their instincts driving them toward birth regardless of whether their mother could survive the process. Adrian materialized in the medical suite with blood on his hands and desperation in his eyes, having fought his way through federal agents and shadow creatures to reach her side as her condition deteriorated beyond Elena's ability to stabilize through conventional vampire medicine. The choice he presented was stark in its finality and terrifying in its implications for everything she had fought to preserve about her essential humanity. He could temporarily transform her into a vampire, giving her the supernatural healing and strength necessary to survive delivery of hybrid offspring whose birth requirements exceeded human physical capabilities. But the transformation would fundamentally alter her nature in ways that could not be predicted or reversed. Sarah's response came through gritted teeth as another contraction threatened to tear her consciousness apart, her medical mind understanding that death was the only alternative to accepting changes that would make her something other than the human woman who had walked into that examination room weeks ago. The partial transformation began as Adrian's blood flowed into her system with concentrated supernatural energy that rewrote her cellular structure while preserving her essential consciousness and memories. Sarah felt her bones strengthening to support stresses that would shatter normal human anatomy, her muscles gaining supernatural resilience that allowed them to stretch beyond natural limitations without tearing. Her enhanced healing began repairing damage from the baby's movements almost as quickly as it occurred, while her senses sharpened to perceive threats and opportunities that had been invisible to her human awareness. The change was neither complete vampire transformation nor simple enhancement of human capabilities, but something unprecedented that reflected the unique circumstances of her pregnancy and bond with Adrian. She retained her human emotional responses and moral reasoning while gaining physical abilities that allowed her to participate actively in the defense of their sanctuary rather than remaining a passive victim requiring protection. As federal agents breached the penthouse's outer defenses and Victoria's supernatural assassins closed in on their location, Sarah discovered that her transformation had given her not just the strength to survive delivery, but the power to fight for her children's future with capabilities that exceeded anything their enemies had anticipated when planning their coordinated assault on the one person whose existence threatened to reshape the balance between human and vampire worlds forever. The delivery took place in a symphony of chaos that would have been impossible to survive without the supernatural enhancements flowing through Sarah's transformed physiology, her body adapting in real time to demands that exceeded every limitation her medical training had taught her to expect from human anatomy. Adrian's hands guided her through contractions that felt like seismic shifts in reality itself, while Elena coordinated surgical procedures that combined vampire healing techniques with human medical precision in ways that had never been attempted in supernatural history. The sound of federal agents breaching the penthouse's outer defenses mixed with inhuman shrieks from Victoria's shadow creatures as Sarah's enhanced senses tracked multiple threats converging on their location, while her consciousness divided between the overwhelming physical demands of labor and the tactical awareness that her partial transformation had awakened. The first twin emerged with a silence that spoke of supernatural control already manifesting, her daughter choosing to appear perfectly human in coloring and features, despite the circumstances of her birth, her vampire nature concealed so completely that even Elena's enhanced perception could barely detect the supernatural energy contained within the infant's small form. The second birth followed with her son displaying the opposite approach, his vampire characteristics clearly visible in golden eyes and pale skin that marked him as Adrian's heir, while demonstrating the same conscious choice about his appearance that his sister had shown moments before. Their immediate response to the chaos surrounding their birth was to become completely still and quiet, understanding instinctively that their survival depended on avoiding detection by the hostile forces threatening their family, a level of awareness and strategic thinking that exceeded anything documented in previous hybrid offspring and vindicated every argument Sarah had made to the Elder Council about their unprecedented nature. Elena worked with supernatural speed to ensure both children were healthy, while Adrian maintained defensive positions that kept federal agents and shadow creatures from reaching the medical suite. But Sarah could feel Victoria Sterling's presence growing closer with each passing moment, as the Vampire Queen's forces systematically eliminated the penthouse's outer defenses. Her partial transformation had given Sarah abilities she was still learning to control, enhanced strength and speed that allowed her to assist in the defense rather than remaining helpless while others fought for her children's survival. But, more importantly, it had granted her the supernatural senses necessary to track Victoria's approach through the building's increasingly compromised security perimeter. When Victoria finally appeared in the medical suite with blood on her ancient hands and madness in her eyes, Sarah understood that the confrontation between her and Adrian represented not just personal vendetta, but a fundamental clash between vampire traditions that valued isolation and the unprecedented future her children symbolized. Adrian's transformation into something purely predatory was complete and terrifying in its intensity. 8 centuries of accumulated power focused into combat reflexes that moved too quickly for normal perception to follow. But Victoria matched him with abilities refined by even greater age and a complete lack of restraint about collateral damage to human authorities who might witness their supernatural battle. Sarah's role in the confrontation surprised everyone present, including herself, as her enhanced abilities allowed her to anticipate Victoria's attacks and provide tactical support that turned what should have been an evenly matched duel into a coordinated assault that the ancient vampire queen could not counter effectively. Her medical knowledge combined with supernatural perception let her identify vulnerabilities in Victoria's fighting style that stemmed from centuries of relying on superior individual power rather than cooperative strategy. Weaknesses that Adrian could exploit once Sarah provided the necessary tactical analysis through their psychic bond. Victoria's defeat was absolute and final, her ancient form crumbling to dust as Adrian's killing blow severed connections to supernatural forces that had sustained her existence since before the Roman Empire. But her destruction brought no immediate relief, because federal agents were still advancing through the building with equipment that could expose vampire society to human authorities despite the supernatural battle that had just concluded. The resolution of human law enforcement involvement required Adrian to exercise influence that extended far beyond his usual political reach, calling in favors and applying pressure that reached the highest levels of federal government while ensuring that all evidence of supernatural activity was systematically eliminated or discredited. Agent Martinez and her team found themselves reassigned to different cases, with memories carefully altered to remove any recollection of supernatural elements they might have witnessed, while official reports attributed the disturbances at the penthouse to a gas leak explosion that had tragically claimed the life of Dr. Sarah Chen, along with several other building occupants whose bodies were never recovered due to the intensity of the fire that had supposedly consumed the upper floors. Sarah's official death certificate was filed within days of the confrontation, effectively erasing her legal existence from all human records while providing the cover story necessary to explain her disappearance to any remaining human connections who might ask uncomfortable questions about her fate. The new identity that replaced her former life was necessarily vague and deliberately incomplete, a construct that would allow her to exist within vampire society while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to whatever role her unprecedented status would require as her children grew and their unique nature became better understood by supernatural communities worldwide. She was no longer Dr. Sarah Chen, reproductive endocrinologist and human woman with a defined place in mortal society, but Sarah Blackthorne, consort to the vampire king and mother of hybrid heirs, whose existence challenged every assumption both species held about their fundamental nature and future possibilities. The transformation was more than merely legal or social. It represented a complete reconstruction of identity that acknowledged her evolved nature as something that belonged fully to neither world, but served as a bridge between them, with responsibilities that exceeded anything her human life had prepared her to handle. 6 months after the children's birth, Sarah had adapted to vampire society with surprising ease while carving out a unique role that utilized her medical expertise to serve supernatural communities that had previously lacked access to modern medical knowledge adapted for their specific physiological needs. Her practice operated from Adrian's estate, treating vampires whose ancient injuries required contemporary surgical techniques and providing prenatal care for the increasing number of supernatural beings whose romantic relationships with humans were producing offspring that defied traditional biological categories. The twins' development exceeded every projection Elena had made about hybrid growth patterns, their personalities emerging with clarity that reflected their dual nature while demonstrating remarkable control over which aspects of their heritage they chose to express at any given moment. Marcus spoke in complete sentences by 4 months, his vocabulary drawing from both modern English and ancient languages. He absorbed through proximity to vampire society, while Lydia showed artistic abilities that seemed to transform her emotional states into visual representations that appeared on paper without conscious effort on her part. Both children demonstrated supernatural strength when necessary, but chose to appear perfectly human when interacting with the few mortal visitors who occasionally came to Adrian's estate. Their instinctive understanding of when to conceal their abilities, suggesting intelligence that operated on levels their parents were still learning to comprehend. Sarah's role as advisor to vampire leadership evolved naturally from her unique perspective as someone who understood both human and supernatural psychology, her insights helping to shape policies that governed increasingly complex interactions between vampires and the mortal world they inhabited without fully participating in its social structures. Her medical knowledge proved invaluable for understanding how supernatural beings could adapt to environmental changes caused by human technological advancement, while her experience with human bureaucracy allowed vampire society to navigate legal and political challenges that their traditional isolation had left them unprepared to handle. The Elder Council consulted her regularly on matters involving human-vampire relations, recognizing that her unprecedented status as a bridge between worlds gave her insights that pure vampires lacked, despite their accumulated centuries of experience with mortal societies. Adrian's relationship with Sarah had deepened beyond the bonds of supernatural necessity or political alliance into genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared responsibility for challenges that neither could face alone. Their connection strengthened by the daily demands of raising children whose nature required both vampire wisdom and human empathy to guide properly. Their personal moments together revealed depths to Adrian's character that 8 centuries of rulership had forced him to suppress, while Sarah's influence helped him rediscover aspects of leadership that emphasized protection and nurture rather than domination and fear. The romantic elements of their relationship developed gradually and naturally as they learned to trust each other completely, their bond evolving from supernatural compulsion to genuine affection that acknowledged the sacrifices both had made to protect their family and the future it represented for supernatural society as a whole. However, the children's unprecedented nature had attracted attention from supernatural communities beyond vampire society, with reports reaching Adrian's intelligence networks of werewolf packs and ancient witch covens expressing interest in meeting the hybrid offspring whose existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the impossibility of crossbreeding between supernatural species. Dragons, who had remained hidden from both human and vampire societies for millennia, sent emissaries inquiring about the children's potential magical abilities, while shapeshifter communities debated whether hybrid offspring might possess transformation capabilities that exceeded anything their own bloodlines had produced. These inquiries represented both opportunities for expanding supernatural alliances and potential threats from beings whose motivations remained unclear, but whose power could destabilize the careful balance Adrian had maintained throughout his territories. Sarah understood that her children represented hope for peaceful coexistence between human and supernatural worlds, but also new dangers that neither species had previously faced, because no one had ever successfully bridged the gap between mortal and immortal societies. The twins were growing up with choices about their fundamental nature that she had never possessed, able to decide moment by moment whether to embrace their human heritage or their vampire legacy, without being trapped permanently in either identity. Their ability to consciously control which aspects of their dual nature they expressed meant they could potentially serve as ambassadors between worlds that had remained separate throughout recorded history, but it also made them targets for those who viewed such bridging as threat to traditional power structures that depended on maintaining clear distinctions between different supernatural communities. The final image that defined Sarah's new existence came during evening hours in Adrian's private garden, watching Marcus and Lydia play games that seamlessly blended human creativity with vampire speed and supernatural perception, while never losing sight of the careful balance their survival required. She observed them making conscious choices about which abilities to use and which to conceal, their natural instincts guided by intelligence that understood the complex political implications of their every action, while still maintaining the innocent joy that marked them as children regardless of their extraordinary heritage. Their laughter carried both human warmth and vampire music, creating harmonies that spoke of possibilities neither species had imagined before their birth, brought new realities into existence that would reshape supernatural society for generations to come. Sarah's journey from trapped victim in an examination room to empowered partner in creating unprecedented futures for both her children and the world they would inherit represented the story's core theme about choice, triumphing over destiny through knowledge, courage, and the willingness to sacrifice old certainties for new possibilities that could benefit everyone involved. The open future that stretched ahead contained challenges that could not be predicted or prevented, but also opportunities for growth and connection that transcended every limitation that had previously defined relationships between human and supernatural communities, with Sarah's family serving as living proof that impossible situations could be transformed into foundations for better realities through determination, wisdom, and love that refused to accept artificial boundaries between different forms of conscious existence.